A love story filled with tension, bound by fate and generations of rivalry. But are they truly enemies, or just two lost souls searching for something greater? Before we begin the story, leave a comment telling us where you're watching from. Enjoy the story. Under the scorching afternoon sun, the city pulsed with relentless energy. Car horns blared, pedestrians rushed along the crowded sidewalks, and neon signs flickered in the golden hues of sunset, their reflections dancing on the towering glass buildings. Among the throng, Seraphina Langley strode with purpose, her pace faster than the standstill traffic beside her. She wasn't the delicate heiress people imagined when they heard the name Langley, one of the most powerful families in the city. No silk dresses or designer heels. Instead, she wore ripped jeans, a superhero-printed t-shirt, and a pair of well-worn white sneakers, scuffed and dusted from city grime. Her long, dark hair was tied in a high ponytail, swinging with each confident step. She had just escaped a grueling boardroom meeting, hours of gray-haired men droning on about stocks, investments, and quarterly profits. Pulling out her phone, she shot a message to her assistant. "Next time there's a meeting like this, find an excuse to get me out. I'd rather rewatch Die Hard." Engrossed in her screen, she didn't notice that fate was leading her toward an encounter she could never have predicted. A few feet away, Cassian Rhodes leaned casually against an old newsstand. Dressed in a simple black t-shirt, dark jeans, and sneakers, he looked nothing like the polished businessman who frequented this part of the city. If anything, he blended into the background, a man merely enjoying a break in the midst of a bustling metropolis. But for those who paid attention, there was something distinct about him. The way he carried himself. Calm, measured, entirely in control. The sharpness in his gaze, scanning his surroundings with the quiet vigilance of someone who never let his guard down. Taking a sip from a water bottle, he exhaled slowly, outwardly relaxed but inwardly alert. And then it happened. A shadow weaved swiftly through the crowd. A pickpocket. Slipping between distracted pedestrians, he made his move. In one seamless motion, he lifted a wallet from a middle-aged woman's purse, the theft so precise that she remained blissfully unaware. But Cassian saw everything. Cassian reacts instantly. Step 1. He set down his water bottle, stepping into the thief's path before he could escape. Step 2. The thief panicked. In a last-ditch effort, he flung the stolen wallet toward Cassian as a distraction and sprinted into the crowd. Step 3. Cassian instinctively caught the wallet, about to call out to the woman. But then, a voice rang out, sharp and commanding. "Accomplice! Someone stop him!" Seraphina. She had barely looked up from her phone when she saw it. A man in black, standing in the middle of the sidewalk, holding a wallet. Meanwhile, the real thief was already disappearing into the sea of bodies. In her mind, the pieces clicked instantly. A dirty exchange. He just received the stolen wallet. Without hesitation, she charged. The flying kick, Cassian barely had time to process what was happening when, wham! A spinning kick came out of nowhere. He tried to dodge, but the strike grazed his arm with enough force to throw him off balance. He stumbled, hitting the pavement hard. The wallet flew from his grip. Around them, onlookers froze. A few even pulled out their phones, capturing the chaos unfolding before them. Cassian blinked in shock. He looked up, only to be met with Seraphina's fierce, accusing glare. Did she just kick me? And worse, she has no idea what she just did. Seraphina flicked her ponytail over her shoulder, triumphant, and turned to the crowd. "Got him. No need to thank me?" The most awkward moment in history. A confused voice suddenly called out, "That's not the thief. He was helping me. The pickpocket's victim. Seraphina froze. Cassian sat up, one hand bracing against the ground, his expression shifting between disbelief and irritation. Do you always kick people first and ask questions later? Seraphina opened her mouth, ready to argue, but the truth was staring her in the face. She had just attacked an innocent man. Scene conclusion. Seraphina and Cassian stood in the middle of the street, facing each other. The tension crackled, not just from the ridiculous misunderstanding, but from something far bigger that neither of them could yet name. This wasn't just a case of mistaken identity. This was the beginning of something much more dangerous. The world around them continued to move. But for Seraphina and Cassian, everything had come to a screeching halt. A few seconds ago, she had been standing victorious, convinced she had just thwarted a criminal operation. Now she stood frozen, her heart hammering against her ribcage, while a wave of embarrassment began to creep up her spine. The words of the bystander, the woman whose wallet had nearly been stolen, hung heavy in the air. "That's not the thief. He was helping me." The murmurs of the crowd grew louder. People whispered to each other, some snickering, others pulling out their phones to capture the scene. Cassian Rhodes, still sitting on the pavement, exhaled sharply and flexed his wrist. He had taken harder hits before, but never from someone who was supposed to be completely oblivious to his existence. His sharp, calculating gaze flickered up to the woman standing over him, the one who had just drop-kicked him to the ground. And she wasn't even sorry. Seraphina, though stunned, refused to let her confidence waver. She lifted her chin, arms crossed over her chest, as if daring him to say something. "How was I supposed to know?" she challenged. "You looked suspicious." Cassian scoffed, finally pushing himself off the ground with a controlled, effortless movement. The smirk that pulled at his lips didn't reach his eyes. "You see a guy catch a wallet and assume he's a criminal? Maybe you should stay off those action movies for a while." A flicker of something, annoyance, perhaps embarrassment, crossed Seraphina's face, but she masked it quickly. She wasn't about to let him get the upper hand. The crowd shifted as a pair of police officers pushed their way through. The older officer, his badge gleaming under the harsh afternoon sun, took one sweeping glance at the situation before folding his arms. "All right, what the hell happened here?" Seraphina immediately jumped at the opportunity. "Officer, I caught him red-handed. He was holding a stolen wallet." Cassian let out a breath through his nose, barely suppressing a laugh. "Right. And then she drop-kicked me in the middle of the street." The younger cop raised an eyebrow, shifting his gaze toward Seraphina. "You did that?" Seraphina squared her shoulders, nodding. "I was intervening." The officer sighed, rubbing his temples. "Both of you, police station. Now." Seraphina's stomach dropped. Cassian, however, looked thoroughly amused. "Well," he said smoothly, brushing dirt off his jeans. "This should be fun." The police station smelled of stale coffee and old paperwork. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed softly, casting a sterile glow over the small interrogation room. Inside, the air was thick with unspoken tension. Seraphina sat stiffly in a metal chair, arms crossed tightly, her jaw clenched. Across from her, Cassian was the picture of relaxation, one arm draped over the back of his chair, the other lazily tapping against the tabletop. The officer sitting across from them flipped through a thin file, clearly already tired of the two of them. "All right," he said flatly. "One of you want to explain why we had to bring you both in here?" Seraphina didn't hesitate. Cassian cut in smoothly, tilting his head. They both stopped, glaring at each other. The officer sighed. "Fantastic. This is going to take all day." Seraphina shot Cassian a pointed look. "You first," she said through gritted teeth. Cassian shrugged. Happy to oblige. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table, his tone infuriatingly casual. Let's see. I was standing at a newsstand, minding my own business, when I saw some guy steal a wallet. Naturally, I stopped him. Then someone, he cast a glance at Seraphina, decided she was the main character in an action movie and decided to kick me before bothering to check what was actually happening. Seraphina scoffed. Oh, please! Hang on, I'm not finished, Cassian said smoothly, holding up a hand. She narrowed her eyes but didn't interrupt. Cassian smirked. Then, in a stunning display of logic, she insisted that I was a criminal, refused to listen to reason. And now, here we are. Seraphina bristled. Oh, I'm so sorry I mistook you for a thief while you were standing there holding stolen property. What a terrible assumption to make. Cassian arched an eyebrow. You didn't just assume. You went full karate mode on me. Seraphina leaned forward. Well, maybe if you didn't look so suspicious. The officer pinched the bridge of his nose. All right, enough. He pushed a laptop toward them, turning the screen so they could see the paused security footage. Seraphina swallowed hard. The video showed everything, clear as day. The real thief, the wallet being thrown, Cassian catching it. She felt her face burn. The officer pressed play. That looked like a criminal to you? Seraphina said nothing. Cassian, to her absolute frustration, just sat back and smirked. You could say sorry, he mused. Seraphina exhaled sharply through her nose. I could, but I won't. Cassian chuckled, shaking his head. Unbelievable. The officer stood, clearly done with both of them. You're both free to go, but maybe next time try not to assault random civilians in broad daylight, yeah? Cassian rose first, adjusting his jacket. Duly noted, officer. Seraphina, however, lingered for a moment. She wasn't used to being wrong, and she definitely wasn't used to people calling her out on it. She turned to leave, but before she could step out of the room, Cassian leaned slightly closer, his voice lower. You know, for someone so quick to judge, you don't seem like the type to back down from a fight. Seraphina turned sharply, her eyes narrowing. What's that supposed to mean? Cassian tilted his head, a knowing look in his eyes. It means, he said, I have a feeling this won't be the last time we cross paths. And with that, he walked out. Seraphina stood there, her fingers curling into fists. She should have been relieved to put this ridiculous situation behind her. But deep down, she had a nagging feeling. Something told her that Cassian Rhodes wasn't going anywhere. The restaurant was the kind of place where silence felt expensive. Crystal chandeliers hung low, casting a golden glow over polished tables covered in pristine white linen. Waiters in crisp uniforms moved like shadows, weaving through the guests with practiced precision. Seraphina Langley strode in, her heels clicking softly against the marble floor. She had dressed for business. A sleek black dress, hair pinned back into an elegant chignon, her every move calculated and effortless. She was here for one reason, to finalize a contract that could elevate her father's company to a new level. The kind of deal that would make headlines. What she wasn't here for was him. And yet, fate had other plans. Just as she stepped past the entrance, her foot landed squarely on something solid. Before she could process what was happening, a sharp gasp escaped someone behind her. And then, chaos. A deep, masculine voice muttered a low curse. A chair scraped harshly against the floor, the unmistakable clink of a glass slipping, then shattering. Seraphina turned just in time to see the damage. A man stood before her, his tailored charcoal-gray suit now drenched in deep red liquid. The unmistakable scent of expensive wine filled the air. Drops slid down the fine wool, soaking into the pristine white dress shirt beneath. Cassian Rhodes. Of course it was him. Of all the people she could have run into in this city, it had to be him. He exhaled sharply, tilting his head as he examined the growing stain spreading across his torso. Then, slowly, too slowly, he lifted his gaze and locked eyes with her. Really? His voice was a study in restraint, but the flicker of irritation in his eyes betrayed him. We meet again? And this is how you greet me? Seraphina crossed her arms, refusing to let him see even a flicker of guilt. Well, she said smoothly, you shouldn't have been standing there. Cassian let out a low laugh, shaking his head. Right. I should have known to watch out for flying glasses of wine and stray designer heels. Seraphina lifted a brow. I was walking in a straight line. It's not my fault you decided to be an obstacle. A waiter rushed forward, stammering apologies, offering Cassian a fresh napkin. Cassian took it, but didn't break eye contact with her. You really have a habit of ruining my clothes, don't you? Seraphina smirked. Oh, I can do worse. For a long moment, neither of them moved. The tension stretched between them like an invisible wire, humming with something neither of them wanted to name. Then, as if on cue, a familiar voice called her name. Her business associate had arrived. With one last lingering glance at Cassian, who was still dabbing at the ruined vest, Seraphina turned and walked away. But as she took her seat, she couldn't shake the feeling of his gaze burning into her back. And worse, she didn't hate it. The auction house was filled with the kind of people who could drop 6 figures on a single painting without blinking. The air smelled of aged wood and old money. Seraphina didn't particularly love these events, but she knew their value. Strategic networking. Power plays disguised as polite conversation. The game within the game. She had her eye on one piece, a small, seemingly insignificant ceramic vase, cracked with faded paint, but a history that whispered of centuries past. It was a collector's item, one that belonged in the Langley estate. When the auctioneer's voice rang out, she raised her paddle confidently. $100,000. A murmur rippled through the crowd, but then 150,000. The voice was smooth, assured, familiar. Seraphina turned her head, and there he was. Cassian Rhodes, sitting with all the ease in the world, fingers drumming lazily against the polished wood of his chair. Of course it was him. Her lips pressed into a thin line. $200,000. Cassian smirked. $300,000. A hush fell over the room. The stakes had suddenly changed. Seraphina lifted her chin. $500,000. A slow whistle escaped Cassian's lips. Impressive. Then, without hesitation, $1 million. A collective gasp. Seraphina's fingers tightened around her paddle. This isn't even your style, she said under her breath, loud enough for only him to hear. Cassian tilted his head. You think I'm here for the vase? Her heart gave an infuriating lurch. Damn him. She dropped her paddle. The auctioneer slammed the gavel. Sold, to Mr. Rhodes. Cassian turned to her, all arrogance and satisfaction. Better luck next time, Langley. She narrowed her eyes. Enjoy your cracked vase. Cassian chuckled. Oh, I will. But you know, you could have fought harder. Seraphina stood, smoothing her dress. She leaned in slightly, her voice dropping to a whisper only he could hear. Oh, Cassian. She smiled sweetly. I never lose. I just pick my battles. And with that, she walked away, leaving him with nothing but the sound of her heels clicking against the marble floor. Cassian watched her go, lips curling into an amused grin. For the second time in weeks, she had walked away first. and for some reason, he hated it. The problem with running into the same person repeatedly, especially someone you don't want to run into, is that sooner or later, the tension changes. It stops feeling like coincidence. It starts feeling like inevitability. Seraphina realized it first when she caught herself smirking at one of his teasing texts. Cassian. Still sore about the auction? Seraphina. Still clutching that broken vase? She should have ignored him. She should have hated these little interactions. But instead she found herself waiting for them. Cassian, on the other hand, knew it even earlier. The first time he saw her across the restaurant, stepping over broken glass, fire in her eyes, daring him to push back, he had known. And that was the most dangerous part. Because for the first time in his life, he wasn't sure if he wanted to fight back. In a world where names were more than just names, where they were empires, legacies, and battle flags, Seraphina Langley and Cassian Rhodes were never meant to cross paths. Yet fate had drawn them together, again and again, like opposing forces in an inevitable collision. What had started as clashes, sharp words, unspoken challenges, battles over pride, had become something neither of them had expected. Something dangerous. Something real. But love, in their world, was never just about two people. It was about power, about control. And when their families found out, the cost of their feelings became terrifyingly clear. It started with a single photograph, a glossy, high-resolution image plastered across business magazines, online headlines, and whispered conversations among the elite. Seraphina and Cassian. Together. The event had been innocent enough. A charity gala, all chandeliers and champagne. The kind of night where alliances were made over whispered toasts. Yet in that one fateful moment, a photographer had captured something else. Cassian, leaning in ever so slightly, his lips curled in that infuriating, knowing smirk. Seraphina, eyes locked onto his, the ghost of a smile tugging at the corner of her mouth. The chemistry was undeniable. And in the ruthless world of corporate dynasties, chemistry between enemies was not just scandalous. It was war. The Langley estate was a fortress of old money and rigid traditions. Massive marble pillars loomed at the entrance, cold and unyielding, much like the man who ruled over it. Nathaniel Langley stood in his study, a glass of whiskey in hand, staring down at the damning photograph on his desk. His grip on the crystal tumbler was so tight, his knuckles turned white. Then, in a single motion, he hurled the glass against the fireplace. It shattered, the sound slicing through the silence like a gunshot. When Seraphina entered, the tension in the air was suffocating. "Sit." She remained standing. "Is this how you repay me?" His voice was quiet, too quiet, the kind of quiet that promised a storm. Seraphina squared her shoulders. "I don't owe you an explanation." Nathaniel's eyes burned with something dangerous. "You don't owe me? You carry the Langley name, girl. Everything you have, everything is because of me." She clenched her fists. "Number everything I have is because I earned it." A bitter laugh. "Earned it? And what do you think you're doing now? Playing house with the son of a woman who has spent decades trying to tear this family apart?" Seraphina flinched but didn't look away. "Cassian is not his mother." Nathaniel stepped closer. "And you are not just you, Seraphina. You are my daughter, a Langley. That means something." A heavy pause. Then his voice dropped lower, colder. "If you continue this nonsense, you are no longer my daughter." Seraphina felt the weight of his words sink in, pressing against her ribs like an iron cage. She had always known her father was ruthless in business, but she had never truly believed he would be ruthless with her. Across the city, another confrontation was brewing. The Rhodes estate was a modern contrast to the Langleys' old-world wealth. Sleek, minimalist, cold. Victoria Rhodes, draped in a tailored navy dress, sat poised in a high-backed leather chair, a vision of controlled power. Her son, however, stood across from her like a caged animal, hands braced against the edge of her polished desk. She didn't raise her voice. She never needed to. "Tell me," she mused, tapping a manicured nail against the photograph on her desk. "How exactly do you plan to explain this?" Cassian exhaled sharply, barely glancing at the picture. "There's nothing to explain." Victoria lifted a brow. "So you admit you've been seeing her?" He didn't deny it. She leaned back. "Cassian, I have spent years ensuring the Rhodes legacy thrives. Do you think I did that so you could throw it away over some—" His jaw tightened. "Don't finish that sentence." Her lips curved, just slightly. "I see." She folded her hands, gaze assessing. "If you choose this path, you will lose everything." He let out a hollow laugh. "Everything?" Victoria met his eyes with a cold, unshaken certainty. "The company, the inheritance, the seat at the table you've been groomed for since birth. I will not allow a Langley to infiltrate what I have built." Cassian's chest rose and fell with measured breath. "So that's it? My entire life, every deal, every decision, it all vanishes because of one person." "No," Victoria corrected. "It vanishes because of your choice." A sharp silence. Then, "I'd rather lose everything than lose her." Victoria's expression didn't change, but something flickered in her gaze. Something almost like disappointment. Not in him, but in the fact that he had been willing to walk away so easily. 2 names, 2 families, 2 legacies forged in power and opposition, and now, 2 hearts caught in the middle. Cassian and Seraphina met that night in the only place they knew they wouldn't be found. The rooftop of an abandoned hotel, overlooking the glowing skyline of a city that had given them everything, and taken everything. They stood in silence for a long time, the wind tangling through Seraphina's dark hair, the city lights reflecting in Cassian's stormy eyes. Finally she spoke. "They're forcing me to choose." Cassian nodded slowly. "Mine too." She turned to him, and for the first time her voice wavered. "What do we do?" Cassian exhaled, dragging a hand through his hair. "We fight." A sad smile tugged at her lips. "And if we lose?" He looked at her then, really looked at her. "If we lose," he murmured, brushing a stray strand of hair from her face. "Then at least we go down together." The city stretched before them, endless and unforgiving. But for now, up here, they were just Cassian and Seraphina. Just 2 people trying to hold on to something real, even if the world was already tearing it apart. A night drenched in silence. The city was quiet at this hour, the usual hum of traffic now a distant murmur. Streetlights cast long, ghostly shadows across the empty park, their glow flickering against the damp pavement. A faint mist clung to the air, curling around the bare branches of the trees. It was the kind of night that made everything feel heavier. Seraphina Langley stood near the old stone fountain, her arms wrapped tightly around herself. Not from the cold, but from the weight pressing against her chest. She had been standing there for what felt like an eternity, staring at the rippling water, trying to find the right words. But how do you tell someone you love them, while also telling them goodbye? She heard footsteps behind her. Slow, measured, familiar. Cassian Rhodes. Even without turning, she knew it was him. She knew the way he walked, the way the air shifted ever so slightly when he was near. But tonight, that presence, the one she had grown to crave, to rely on, felt heavier. Like a storm was brewing between them, yet neither could outrun it. He stopped a few feet away, his voice low, hesitant. "You called me here." She nodded but didn't turn. If she met his eyes, she wasn't sure she'd be able to do what needed to be done. A long pause. The silence between them was louder than any words. Finally, Cassian took a step closer. "Seraphina." His voice was softer now, edged with something dangerously close to pleading. She closed her eyes. This was harder than she thought. She forced herself to breathe, forced her heart to slow, and when she finally spoke, her words came out quieter than she intended. "We can't keep doing this." The sentence hung in the air, suspended between them like shattered glass. Cassian stiffened, his jaw clenched, his fists tightening at his sides. "Is that what you really think?" His voice was unreadable, too controlled, too careful. Seraphina swallowed, forcing herself to face him. And there he was. The man who had been her rival, her opponent, her greatest frustration, and now, the love she wasn't allowed to have. His dark eyes searched hers, but she refused to let him see the cracks forming in her resolve. "Cassian." She took a breath, steadied herself. "This isn't just about us." His eyes darkened. "I don't give a damn about them." Her throat tightened. "But I do." For a moment, neither of them spoke. Cassian took another step forward, closing the distance between them. "They don't control us, Seraphina." His voice was raw now, stripped of its usual composure. "We do." A sharp ache twisted inside her. How easy it would be to believe that, to let herself fall into his arms and pretend that the world beyond this moment didn't exist. But that wasn't their reality. Seraphina shook her head, forcing herself to take a step back. "If we keep fighting this, it'll destroy everything." Cassian let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. "Everything? What is everything, Seraphina? A last name? A legacy built on pride and resentment?" His voice softened. "Or is it us?" Her breath hitched, because for one terrifying second she wanted to believe he was right. But then she remembered her father's words, the cold finality in his tone. "If con gap no, con se con la con gai quata." And her mother's silence. The way her family had already started erasing her from their world, as if she had never belonged to it. She had spent her whole life trying to prove she was more than just a name. But now, standing here, she realized she wasn't just fighting for herself. She was fighting against something far bigger. And she was losing. She forced a breath, forced herself to meet Cassian's gaze one last time. "It's over." Cassian's expression flickered just for a moment, a crack in his armor, then just as quickly it was gone. His jaw tightened, his hands curled into fists, but he didn't argue. He just stared at her, and in his silence, she felt something inside her break. The wind stirred between them, cold and unforgiving. Seraphina forced herself to turn away. And then, coward. She froze. Cassian's voice was quiet, but it cut deeper than anything else he could have said. Her fingers curled at her sides, her eyes burned. But she didn't turn back. She couldn't. Instead, she walked away. And this time, Cassian didn't stop her. He just stood there, watching as she disappeared into the night. His fists unclenched, falling uselessly at his sides. And for the first time in his life, Cassian Rhodes had no idea what to do next. A love that couldn't be, a choice that couldn't be undone. And yet, some endings don't last forever. The city buzzed with life, a relentless cycle of movement and noise. But inside Seraphina Langley's penthouse, everything was still. Too still. She had thrown herself into work, burying herself in meetings, projects, and deals that once excited her. But now none of it mattered. No matter how much she tried to distract herself, the moment she walked through the door of her empty apartment, the silence consumed her. She tossed her handbag onto the couch, exhaling sharply. Her gaze fell upon the small silk handkerchief on her desk, the one Cassian had given her that night at the cafe. She had tried to throw it away countless times. She never could. Cassian Rhodes wasn't doing any better. From the outside, it seemed like he had moved on, signing multi-million-dollar deals, appearing at elite business functions, carrying the weight of the Rhodes legacy on his shoulders. But every night, when the world finally quieted, he found himself staring at a small childhood bracelet, one that Seraphina had given him during their visit to the orphanage charity event. His fingers traced the worn-out leather. "Seraphina, are you okay?" He whispered to the night. But he never texted, never called. That evening, Seraphina attended a high-profile corporate gala, wearing a sleek black evening gown. Her makeup was flawless, her posture perfect. To everyone else, she was the picture of elegance. But inside, she felt like a hollow shell. She held a glass of wine in her hand, swirling it absently, lost in thought. Then she felt it. A presence. When she looked up, she saw him. Cassian. Standing across the room, dressed in a charcoal gray suit, effortlessly poised. For the first time since their separation, their eyes met. The crowded ballroom around them faded. Her grip on the wine glass tightened. He raised his glass ever so slightly, his expression unreadable. Neither of them spoke. Neither of them moved. But they both knew. Neither had truly forgotten. Late at night. A lonely apartment. The city lights flickered outside Seraphina's window, casting soft shadows on the polished hardwood floor. She sat curled up on the couch, a half-empty bottle of red wine on the table in front of her. She had tried to be strong, but tonight her emotions had won. She took another sip, letting the warmth of the alcohol spread through her, numbing everything but the one thought that wouldn't leave her mind. Cassian. He was everywhere, in her dreams, in the streets, in the songs playing on the radio. "I can't keep doing this," she murmured to herself, draining the last of her wine. Then, suddenly, she stood up. Without thinking, without hesitation, she grabbed her coat and rushed out the door. The rain had started to fall, a light drizzle misting the streets. But she didn't care. She needed to see him. At Cassian's apartment, Seraphina's fists pounded against the door. "Cassian, open up!" No answer. She knocked again, louder. "Cassian Rhodes! If you don't open this door right now, I swear I'll—" The door creaked open. Cassian stood there, bleary-eyed, his tousled hair falling over his forehead. He was wearing an old t-shirt and sweatpants, clearly having been asleep. But the moment he saw her, soaking wet, eyes filled with desperation, sleep was the last thing on his mind. "Seraphina?" She didn't wait. She threw herself into his arms. Cassian barely had time to react before Seraphina wrapped her arms around him, holding on as if he were the only thing keeping her from falling apart. Her body trembled against his, and then she whispered the words she had held back for too long. "You idiot! I miss you!" Cassian stiffened, and then something inside him gave way. He pulled her in, holding her close, his chin resting lightly on the top of her head. "Me too, Seraphina," he murmured, his voice raw. They stood there, in the dimly lit hallway, as the city outside continued on, unaware that, for these two souls, the world had just stopped. Cassian finally loosened his grip and looked at her. "How much have you had to drink?" he asked, his voice tinged with amusement. Seraphina sniffed. "Not enough to forget you." A rare smile touched Cassian's lips. He took her hand and led her inside, closing the door behind them. His apartment was small but warm, with soft lighting and bookshelves filled with old novels. Seraphina swayed slightly. Cassian caught her and gently guided her to the couch. She collapsed onto it, exhausted. Without a word, he grabbed a blanket and draped it over her. As he sat beside her, watching her finally drift into sleep, something inside him settled. It had been so long since he had felt this. Peace. Even if tomorrow brought more complications, even if the world still stood between them, at least tonight she was here. And for now, that was enough. The rain outside had stopped. The city continued on as always, indifferent to the lives of those within it. But in this quiet little apartment, two people had found their way back to each other, even if just for one night. The question was, would morning bring them together or tear them apart once more? The morning after. The first thing Seraphina felt was the pounding headache, a dull, relentless ache spreading from her temples. She groaned, shifting under the blanket, blinking against the soft morning light filtering through the sheer curtains. The room was unfamiliar. Then it hit her. She wasn't at home. She turned her head and saw him. Cassian sat at the small kitchen counter, stirring a cup of coffee, his gaze distant, lost in thought. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The air between them was thick with unsaid words, with emotions neither of them knew how to process. But beneath it all, there was something else. Something warm, something steady. Something that felt like home. Cassian broke the silence first. "I can't do this anymore, Seraphina." His voice was calm but firm. She sat up slowly, rubbing her temples. "I know." He looked at her then, his deep gray eyes searching hers. "Let's leave." Seraphina froze. "Leave," she echoed, her voice barely above a whisper. "Leave everything," Cassian said. "The family legacies, the business wars, the expectations. Let's walk away. Just us." She stared at him, heart pounding. Cassian leaned forward, his fingers tightening around the coffee mug. "I can't live without you. If you say yes, we leave today. No second thoughts, no looking back." Seraphina's mind raced. The Langley name was a legacy, a burden she had carried her entire life. The weight of expectations, of obligations, of a future that had never truly felt like hers. And Cassian, he had his own chains, his own cage, built by his family's empire. They weren't just fighting for love. They were fighting for freedom. She took a deep breath. Then, slowly, she smiled. "Let's go." Seraphina grabbed her phone, her hands steady despite the gravity of what she was about to do. She typed a short message to her father. "I'm sorry, but I choose my own happiness." She hit send. Cassian, meanwhile, took a pen and scribbled a note on a piece of paper, placing it on his desk. "I will live my own life. Don't look for me." With that, they packed. Not much, just the essentials. A few clothes, a handful of personal items, their passports. They moved quickly, efficiently, their hearts racing with the weight of what they were doing. When everything was packed, Cassian grabbed his car keys. Outside, an old but reliable black sedan waited in the driveway. They tossed their bags in the trunk, then stood for a moment, looking back at the city skyline. This had been their home. But home had never really felt like home, until now, standing beside each other, about to throw everything away for love. Cassian reached for her hand. Seraphina laced her fingers through his. Without another word, they got into the car. Cassian turned the key, the engine rumbled to life, and they drove away, leaving behind a world that had tried to keep them apart. As the city faded in the rearview mirror, Seraphina glanced at Cassian. For the first time in a long time, he wasn't wearing that guarded expression. For the first time, they were truly free. but freedom always comes at a price. And soon, they would find out just how much it would cost them. A new beginning in a small town. Nestled in the heart of a sleepy little town, far from the towering skyscrapers and suffocating legacies of their past, Seraphina and Cassian built a life that was completely their own. Their cafe, whimsically named Goofy and full of drama, was small, rustic, and filled with mismatched furniture that Seraphina insisted added character. The walls were adorned with photos of their travels, scribbled notes from customers, and a hand-painted sign above the counter that read, "No stress, no business talk, just coffee and chaos." And chaos, indeed, was a daily special. Seraphina, despite her confidence in most areas of life, was a disaster behind the counter. She could run billion-dollar deals but somehow couldn't pour a cup of coffee without spilling it. Cassian, determined to be the responsible one, took up baking. But his creations were often either burnt beyond recognition or raw in the middle. They argued over recipes. They laughed over failures. They served customers with flour on their faces and coffee stains on their aprons. And for the first time, life felt simple. Real happy. But happiness never comes without a price. One quiet afternoon, as the golden sunlight streamed through the cafe windows, a familiar presence entered. A woman, dressed in a crisp, elegant suit, her silver-streaked hair pinned perfectly in place. She didn't need to announce herself. Seraphina saw her first. Cassian felt it before he even turned around. Victoria Rhodes, his mother. She sat in the corner, her posture poised, her expression unreadable as she watched them. Seraphina instinctively reached for Cassian's hand beneath the counter, squeezing it tightly. He squeezed back. Then, with measured steps, he walked toward her. Cassian stopped in front of her table, arms crossed, his voice cool and steady. "What are you doing here?" Victoria, ever the composed matriarch, didn't flinch. She simply reached for the cup of coffee Seraphina had set down, lifted it to her lips, and took a slow sip. "I wanted to see if you were happy," she said finally. Cassian narrowed his eyes. "And?" Victoria glanced around the cafe, her gaze lingering on the messy chalkboard menu, the slightly wobbly chairs, the smiling customers who clearly adored this place. Then she looked at her son, at the quiet peace in his face, at the way Seraphina stood close, protective, unyielding. And for the first time in her life, she did something Cassian never expected. She nodded. "I was wrong," she admitted. "Be happy, Cassian." She set the cup down, stood up, and without another word, walked out the door. Cassian stood frozen. Seraphina stared after Victoria, stunned. The woman who had once warned Cassian that loving her would ruin his life had just given them her blessing? The cafe felt oddly quiet in her absence. Seraphina turned to Cassian, searching his face. "Are you okay?" He exhaled, slow and measured, then turned to her with a half smirk. Well, that was unexpected. She laughed, and just like that, the tension broke. But deep down, a single thought lingered in both their minds. If Victoria Rhodes could let go of the past, would Nathaniel Langley do the same? Or was another battle waiting just around the corner? Will their love truly conquer all? Or is this just the calm before the storm? Do you believe in love against all odds? Comment, "True love," if you do.